At an airport, a police officer stops a black woman from boarding her flight, questioning her credentials while letting others pass without issue. He assumes she doesn't belong, but he has no idea who she really is. As tensions rise, the woman remains calm, making a single phone call. Moments later, the airport manager rushes over, his face turning pale. Why is he suddenly nervous? What shocking truth is about to be revealed? When the officer finally learns her true identity, it's already too late. His career is about to take a turn he never saw coming. You won't believe what happens next. The airport buzzed with the usual rush of travelers, flight announcements echoing overhead as passengers moved through security. But near Gate 12, a tense confrontation was unfolding. Officer Brian Reynolds stood firmly in front of a young black woman, his hand raised to block her path. His sharp, authoritative voice cut through the air. "I'm going to need you to step aside, ma'am." The woman, Ava Sinclair, didn't flinch. She stood tall, her expression calm, a phone pressed to her ear. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, being stopped while others passed by without issue. Around them, the crowd began to notice. Some whispered quietly, watching with curiosity. Others averted their gaze, unwilling to get involved. Reynolds glanced at her ticket, then back at her with skepticism. "This doesn't look right. I need further verification." His tone made it clear. He didn't believe she belonged. Ava let out a slow breath, still composed, still unreadable. The officer had no idea who he was dealing with. Before we dive in, have you ever witnessed discrimination like this? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Because what happens next? It leaves everyone in shock. Ava Sinclair moved through the airport with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged. She had spent years building her empire, turning a struggling airline into one of the most prestigious in the industry. As the CEO of Horizon Air, she knew every detail of her business, from flight operations to customer service. But unlike other executives who traveled with VIP treatment, Ava preferred to fly undercover, blending in with everyday passengers to personally assess the experience. Today was no different. Dressed in a sleek lavender dress and modest heels, she exuded elegance but not extravagance. She carried no assistant, no entourage, just her boarding pass and a calm demeanor. As she approached her gate, she noticed the usual chaos of an airport in motion. Families juggling luggage, businessmen rushing to make flights, and security. Officers monitoring the crowd. And then he appeared. Officer Brian Reynolds had worked airport security for over a decade. In his early 40s, with a square jaw and an authoritative stance, he had seen thousands of travelers pass through. But he had a habit, a dangerous one. He believed he could tell who belonged and who didn't just by looking at them. And when his gaze landed on Ava, something in him decided that she didn't. She barely had time to take another step before he moved in front of her, raising his hand. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside." His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. Ava blinked, taken aback but not rattled. She glanced at his badge before meeting his gaze. "Is there a problem?" Reynolds took her boarding pass from her hand without waiting for permission. His eyes flickered across it, but instead of waving her through, his lips pressed into a thin line. Something about her didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, the effortless confidence. Maybe it was the fact that she had a first-class ticket and priority clearance. things he didn't expect from someone like her. He looked at her ID next. A valid passport. Clean, official, but he still wasn't satisfied. "This doesn't match," he said, though it did. Ava exhaled, keeping her voice controlled. "I assure you, it does." Reynolds ignored her, scanning the crowd as if expecting someone to confirm his suspicions. Around them, passengers had begun to notice. Some exchanged uncertain glances. Others simply avoided eye contact, pretending they didn't see what was happening. It was easier that way. A few feet away, Officer Lisa Morales watched the scene unfold. She had worked with Reynolds for years and had seen this pattern before, the way he singled out certain passengers while waving others through. She didn't always agree with it, but she also never challenged him. It wasn't her fight. At least, that's what she told herself. Ava noticed Morales watching but said nothing. She had seen this before, too. Reynolds crossed his arms, shifting his weight. "I need to verify your credentials. Please step over here." Ava didn't move. "I have priority boarding, first class, TSA clearance. Why exactly am I being stopped?" Reynolds' jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job." Ava met his gaze, unflinching. He wasn't doing his job. He was abusing it. But she didn't argue. Not yet. Instead, she slowly reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and made a call. Reynolds smirked, assuming she was calling for backup. Friend, a lawyer, someone who would plead on her behalf. But he had no idea who she had just called, and in a few minutes, his world was about to turn upside down. The tension in the terminal thickened as Officer Brian Reynolds narrowed his eyes at Ava's documents. Her first-class boarding pass and passport were valid, but he refused to accept them at face value. Instead, he studied them as if searching for a flaw, flipping the passport over in his hands, checking the holograms under the light. "This doesn't look right," he muttered, shaking his head. "I need another form of ID." Ava remained calm, reaching into her purse and producing her driver's license, handing it over without hesitation. "That makes 3 official documents confirming who I am," she said, her voice steady. "Is there something else you need?" Reynolds barely glanced at the new ID before scoffing. "I'll have to verify these further. Step aside for additional questioning." Passengers moving through the terminal slowed down, sensing something was off. A few exchanged uneasy glances, while others subtly took out their phones, their cameras. Discreetly capturing what was happening, Ava exhaled slowly. She wasn't surprised. She had dealt with men like him before, men who wielded their authority like a weapon, who demanded obedience just because they could. But she had played this game long enough to know exactly how to respond. She lifted, her gaze, her expression unreadable. "Is there a reason you're questioning me and not the other passengers?" Reynolds stiffened, shifting slightly. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am." "Your job," Ava repeated, tilting her head slightly. "And what exactly about me requires extra verification? The first-class ticket? The TSA pre-check clearance? Or is it something else?" His jaw clenched. He wasn't used to being challenged. "I don't like your tone." Ava raised an eyebrow. "You don't like my tone? Or you don't like that I'm questioning why I'm the only one being pulled aside?" The crowd was watching now. The air had changed. A few passengers who had been hesitant to get involved were now openly staring, their expressions shifting from disinterest to concern. They knew exactly what this looked like. Reynolds crossed his arms, doubling down. "Ma'am, if you don't..." Cooperate. I'll have to call for additional screening. Ava folded her arms right back. By all means. Reynolds hesitated. He had expected compliance, expected her to step aside like so many before her, but she wasn't backing down. His frustration boiled over, and he pulled his radio from his belt. "We have a possible security concern at Gate 12, he said into the receiver, loud enough for everyone around them to hear. "Requesting backup." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Security concern. People exchanged glances, their unease growing. Ava didn't fit the profile of a threat. She was well-dressed, composed, not causing any disturbance. So why was this officer treating her like a criminal? A few feet away, Officer Lisa Morales watched in silence. She could feel the weight of what was happening. She had worked alongside Reynolds long enough to know his patterns, who he stopped, who he let go. And she knew this wasn't about security. This was about power. And for the first time, Reynolds was about to learn what happens when he tries to use it against the wrong person. Ava Sinclair remained calm, her phone still pressed. To her ear, as Officer Reynolds stood rigid in front of her, arms crossed. His smirk was barely concealed, his confidence unshaken. To him, she was just another passenger trying to push back against authority. Another traveler who would eventually comply once the pressure became too much. He assumed she was calling a lawyer, maybe a family member, someone who would argue, but ultimately hold no real power in this situation. He had no idea who she was really calling. Ava's voice remained steady as she spoke. "Yes, I'm still here. Gate 12. There's an issue with your officer. Yes, I'll wait." She lowered the phone slightly, offering Reynolds an expression that was neither fearful nor angry, just patient. That rattled him more than if she had yelled. The seconds stretched. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Officer Morales shifted where she stood, arms stiff at her sides. She had worked with Reynolds for years, but this felt different. Then, in the distance, a man in a crisp navy blue blazer appeared, moving swiftly through the terminal. His security badge gleamed under the overhead lights, and his expression was tight with concern. Reynolds barely noticed him at first. He was too busy reveling in the small victory he thought he had secured. The moment the man reached them, his voice was smooth but urgent. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" For the first time, Officer Reynolds faltered. He turned slightly, his confidence flickering just for a second as he looked at the security manager. Standing beside Ava exhaled and finally lowered her phone. She smoothed the front of her lavender dress and then met Reynolds' gaze without blinking. "Yes," she said, her voice sharp yet measured. "Your officer is preventing me from boarding." She let the words hang for a second, her pause. Intentional. "My own airline's flight." Silence. A ripple of tension passed through the air, so thick it nearly suffocated the terminal. The smirk that had been sitting comfortably on Reynolds' face disappeared instantly. His mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. His eyes darted between Ava and the security manager, confusion washing over him. "What?" Reynolds managed, his voice suddenly much quieter. Ava tilted her head slightly. "I own Horizon Air, the very airline whose flight I am trying to board." A few gasps erupted from the crowd. Some passengers who had been recording the incident zoomed in, capturing every second of the officer's reaction. The security manager stiffened, his eyes widening slightly before turning to Reynolds. "Wait, she's the CEO?" Morales whispered, under her breath, eyes darting toward Ava in disbelief. Reynolds took a step back, his posture changing from arrogance to uncertainty. This wasn't just another passenger he could push around. This was someone who outranked everyone in the room. For the first time since this encounter began, Ava was no longer on the defensive. The power had shifted, and Reynolds knew it. But it was already too late. The moment Ava's words settled in the air, the entire terminal seemed to shift. The once assured security manager stiffened, his expression flickering between confusion and shock. He took a closer look at her, his eyes scanning her face as realization dawned. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "Ms. Sinclair?" His gaze darted between Ava and the Horizon Air logo on the boarding pass still clutched in Officer Reynolds' hand. The weight of the moment hit like a freight train. Reynolds blinked rapidly, his confidence wavering for the first time. He glanced from the security manager to Ava, his rigid authority crumbling as he processed the truth. He hadn't just stopped a passenger. He had profiled, humiliated, and blocked the CEO of the very airline he was supposed to protect. The murmur of the crowd grew louder. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispers turning into hushed shock. Some had suspected something was off, but now it was undeniable. Ava didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Instead, she calmly reached for her phone, pulling up an email, and turned the screen toward the security manager. The official Horizon Air corporate credentials and executive-level clearance glowed under the terminal lights. The proof was irrefutable. A ripple of gasps swept through the crowd. A woman near the gate whispered, "She really is the CEO." Reynolds' face drained of color before turning an embarrassing shade of red. Beads of sweat formed along his brow as his hands twitched at his sides. His voice, once commanding, now trembled with desperation. He stammered. "I had no idea." Ava remained silent, letting him drown in the weight of his own mistake. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, then tried again. "Miss Sinclair, I sincerely apologize. This was a misunderstanding." His words felt weak, forced, as if he was grasping for any way out. She tilted her head slightly but didn't respond. She didn't have to. From the side, Officer Morales finally spoke, stepping forward, her voice steady and firm. "Sir, that is not how we handle security screenings. There was no reason to escalate this." Reynolds turned toward her, his eyes pleading for backup, but there was none to be found. Morales had seen enough, and for the first time, she wasn't looking away. The security manager exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose before fixing Reynolds with a hard stare. "We will be conducting an internal review immediately," he stated. His tone left no room for argument. Ava remained still, watching as the reality of the situation sank into Reynolds. The officer, who had once stood tall, drunk on his own authority, now looked small, his career hanging by a thread, and, "Ava?" She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. The truth had done all the work for her. By the time Ava Sinclair walked away from the confrontation, the damage had already been done. Not to her, but to Officer Brian Reynolds. The entire incident had been recorded by multiple bystanders, their phones capturing every moment. The way he had dismissed her credentials, escalated the situation unnecessarily, and, ultimately, crumbled when he learned the truth. Within hours, the video had made its way online. Social media exploded with outrage. Comments flooded in, demanding accountability, and news outlets quickly picked up the story. Airline CEO denied boarding by her own employee became a headline that no airport or security team wanted attached to their name. The fallout was swift. The airport police launched an immediate internal investigation, and by the next morning, Reynolds was placed on suspension pending disciplinary review. The official statement cited violations of standard security procedures and a failure to uphold unbiased professional conduct. Behind the corporate language, everyone knew what it really meant. He had been caught profiling, and now he was paying the price. Meanwhile, Officer Lisa Morales sat with the weight of her own guilt. She had seen what was happening in real time, had recognized the injustice playing out in front of her, yet she had hesitated, stayed silent. It wasn't until the truth came out that she had finally stepped forward, but by then it had been too late. Sitting in the break room that afternoon, she replayed the moment over in her head. She wished she had spoken up sooner. Next time, she promised herself she wouldn't hesitate. Ava, however, was already moving forward. Without another glance at Reynolds, she calmly walked to her gate, her heels clicking against the polished airport floor. As she approached the boarding lane, passengers who had witnessed the confrontation stepped aside, eyes flickering between admiration and shame. Some nodded at her in silent respect. Others looked away, suddenly embarrassed that they had stood there and done nothing. She didn't acknowledge them. She didn't need to. Ava stepped onto the plane, sliding into her first-class seat, adjusting the soft leather armrest as if nothing had happened. Flight attendants bustled around, ensuring passengers were settled. But there was a newfound awareness in their demeanor, an unspoken recognition of who she was. No one dared to question her now. Just before takeoff, her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. A message from Horizon Air's legal department. Ms. Sinclair, we have completed an internal review. Officer Reynolds has been suspended, and further disciplinary action is being discussed. Please let us know if you require any additional measures. Ava exhaled slowly, staring at the message for a moment before locking her phone and placing it back in her purse. She had already known how this would end. As the engines roared to life and the plane taxied toward the runway, a memory surfaced in her mind. Her father's voice, strong and steady. People will always underestimate you, Ava. Make them regret it. She smiled. Today, she had done exactly that. Discrimination still exists, even in places meant for safety and order. It hides behind authority, masked as policy, disguised as just doing my job. But when we challenge it, when we refuse to be silent, we force change. Ava Sinclair didn't need to argue or raise her voice. The truth spoke for itself. And in the end, the very man who tried to assert power over her ended up losing his own. If this were you, what would you have done? Have you ever witnessed injustice? Have you ever been treated unfairly because of how you look, where you're from, or simply because someone thought they could get away with it? Share your experiences in the comments below. Every story matters. Every voice counts. And if you believe in standing up against discrimination, in holding those in power accountable, subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Together, we can make sure no one abuses authority unchecked. Ava walking onto the plane, her expression unreadable, carrying herself with quiet, unwavering confidence. In the distance, Officer Reynolds watches from afar, his shoulders tense, his face unreadable. He knows he has no power here anymore. He knows he just destroyed his own career,